Now, sometimes you want to run a few asynchronous operations in parallel, and when they all complete, you want to do something after. For example, you may call different APIs like Facebook API and Twitter API, and when the result of both these asynchronous operations are ready, then you want to return something to the client. So let's simulate this. So I'm going to create two promises here. Promise 1, new promise. Again, we give it resolve and reject. Now in this particular implementation, because I don't want to reject this promise, I'm going to exclude this parameter because resolve is the only parameter that we need in this code. So here we call set timeout to start an asynchronous operation. We give it a callback function and a timeout value, 2 seconds. So let's do a simple console.log, asynchronous operation 1. And here we're going to resolve this promise with the value of 1. Okay? So this is our first promise. Let's say this is a simulation for calling Facebook API. Now I'm going to duplicate this code, create another promise. This is going to be our second asynchronous operation, like calling another API, like Twitter API or Instagram. And here we're going to resolve this promise with a different value, like 2. Now, we want to kick off both these asynchronous operations. And when they both complete, we want to do something else after. So we call promise.all. Again, this is another method that is available on the promise class instead of a promise object. Here we give it an array of promises. So I give it an array with P1 and P2. And this method will return a new promise that will be resolved when all the promises in this array are resolved. So we can get that promise and call then. We get the result and display it on the console. Let's see what happens when we run this application. So 2 seconds delay, then both these asynchronous operations, 1 and 2, they're kicked off almost at the same time. And then eventually we get the result, which is an array of 2 numbers. So a few things I need to clarify here. First of all, here we don't have real concurrency. We don't have multi-threading. We're still dealing with one thread, but that single thread is kicking off multiple asynchronous operations almost at the same time. It's not exactly at the same time. First, it starts this asynchronous operation. The thread is released. So immediately after, it starts the second asynchronous operation. We are not waiting for the result of the first asynchronous operation to be ready in order to kick off the second asynchronous operation. This is the situation we had in our previous example where we got the user object, then we got the repositories, then we got the commits for the first repository. So each asynchronous operation started after the previous asynchronous operation completed. That was different. In this implementation, both these asynchronous operations are started almost at the same time. So that's the first thing I wanted to clarify. The second thing is that when we get the result will be available as an array. So in this case, each promise is resolved with a value, in this case 1 and 2. So our result array will have 2 values, 1 and 2. Now, what if one of these promises fails? So let's change the first promise, add the reject parameter here, and instead of resolving this, let's reject it with an error. So new error because something failed. Okay, now here we need to add catch to get the error if one of our promises is rejected. So error goes to console.log. We display error with error.message. Let's run this application. So here's our error. What I wanted to note here is that if any of our promises is rejected, that final promise that is returned from promise.all is considered rejected. Okay? And one last thing before we finish this lecture. So let's go back to our first promise. We don't need reject anymore. Let's just resolve this with the value of 1. Sometimes you may want to kick off multiple asynchronous operations, but you want to do something as soon as one of these asynchronous operations completes. So you don't want to wait for all of them to complete. You just want to do something as soon as the first operation completes. If that's the case, instead of promise.all, you use promise.race. So again, we pass an array of promises. As soon as one promise in this array is fulfilled, the promise that is returned from this race method will be considered fulfilled. So let's see what happens when we run this application. So both our asynchronous operations were started, but our promise was resolved as soon as the first asynchronous operation completed. In this case, the result we have is not an array. It's the value of the first fulfilled promise.